Welcome to the Alcohol Minimalist podcast. I'm your host, Molly Watts. If you want to change your drinking habits and create a peaceful relationship with alcohol, you're in the right place. This podcast explores the strategies I use to overcome a lifetime of family alcohol abuse, more than 30 years of anxiety and worry about my own drinking, and what felt like an unbreakable daily drinking habit. Becoming an alcohol minimalist means removing excess alcohol from your life so it doesn't remove you from life. It means being able to take alcohol or leave it without feeling deprived. It means to live peacefully, being able to enjoy a glass of wine without feeling guilty and without needing to finish the bottle. With science on our side, we'll shatter your past patterns and eliminate your excuses. Changing your relationship with alcohol is possible. I'm here to help you do it. Let's start now. Well, hello and welcome or welcome back to the Alcohol Minimalist podcast with me, your host, Molly Watts, coming to you from, my friends, it is a absolutely gorgeous Oregon. I mentioned it earlier on Monday when I was recording for last week. I talked about how in the future this week, I saw some 60-degree days in my future, the first ones of the spring here in Oregon, and those happened. And I'm in the midst of those right now as I am recording this intro. So wow, it's so much fun to see that sunshine and enjoy that warm weather. And I am very appreciative here in Oregon right now. Today on the podcast, I am talking to Erik Fisher again. And I spoke to Carl way back in 2022, fairly early on to the podcast, all about his book called The Urge, Our History of Addiction. And I saw he had written an article for the New York Times recently on gambling. And it was right around the Super Bowl. And it was talking about the devastation of gambling addictions and how many people were going to be gambling, like in the tune of the billions of dollars over on the Super Bowl Sunday, which is just crazy. And how the prevalence of online forms of gambling and how even video games are setting us up for some struggle with gambling addictions. And I just really enjoyed when we first talked. I loved Carl and I had a really great conversation all around the constructs of addiction and psychology. And so I appreciated what he was sharing, thought it was something that everybody would want to hear about. And so I asked him to come back on the show. Erik Fisher is an addiction physician, bioethicist, writer, and also a person in recovery. He is an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University, and he is the author of The Urge, Our History of Addiction, which was published in January 2022. It was named one of the best books of the year by both the New Yorker, the Boston Globe. And his writing appears in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Scientific American Mind, and elsewhere. Dr. Fisher also maintains a private psychiatry practice with a particular focus on psychotherapeutic approaches incorporating mindfulness and meditation. He is the host of Flourishing After Addiction, and he also hosts a Substack, which you'll hear us talk about, called Rat Park. I know you are going to enjoy this conversation that we had. Here is Dr. Erik Fisher. Hey, Carl, thank you so much for coming back and joining me on the Alcohol Minimalist. It's been a minute since you and I have chatted. We just talked about, or I was rehashing and saying, gosh, it's been 3 years since we first had our first conversation all about your book, The Urge, The History of Addiction. And we're going to touch on that briefly. But the reason that I reached out to you right now is because of a recent essay that you did that landed, I think, in the Times right before or on Super Bowl Sunday about gambling. And you mentioned gambling addiction in The Urge. This is something that is a well-known behavioral addiction. But I thought that your piece in the New York Times was so interesting and something that kind of parallels what I talk about here with regards to alcohol in terms of there's a lot of misconception around like what's actually disordered use, when is it a problem, or when is it an addiction, and this goes back to your book. But let's talk about that article, why you wanted to bring it to everyone's attention, and what makes like emphasis that we have on gambling around, and the Super Bowl so problematic, not only for people that have, that are really suffering from gambling addictions, but for all of us. Why do we want to be concerned about this?
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for having me back on. It's a
Yeah,
pleasure. I'm really glad that you're picking up on this. This question of the gray area where people have problems, but they may not qualify for addiction. They might not identify as being addicted, but still people wonder, what is going on with me? What is do is does what I have qualify as a problem or not? I mean, this I think is like a really essential question for a lot of people. Folks who don't identify as addicted can still have massive problems with gambling. It has tremendous impacts outside of the individual. So, I've always cared a lot about gambling in particular. Seeing it in my patients, there's been massive, massive consequences, and people also struggle in subtle ways as well. Um, but the bottom line is, they asked me, I was just the editor reached out to me and
yeah,
said, "Hey, I've been wondering about gambling, and with the Times has had plenty of pieces on the phenomenon of gambling and the economic explosion of sports gambling and all the celebrities that are winding up to endorse it, and how sports leagues and even some college athletic departments have started to partner economically with sports
right.
gambling institutions. Um, but the editor was looking for something that was about just like, what is the nature of this problem? How do we make sense of this problem? And so I was really, so it's sort of serendipity, but it really nicely aligned with something I've been thinking about and working through, which is making sense of exactly that space, the gray area where it's between total, the personal experience of total abject powerlessness on one hand versus just any other voluntary choice on the other. Like, many of us, myself included, as somebody in long-term recovery from addiction, have had plenty of experiences in the middle ground. And I'm very interested, just at a very pragmatic, graspable level, at ways of expressing that to the general public. I think we need a better vocabulary for just articulating why we would say, for example, pay attention to this incredible and completely unregulated explosion of sports betting in particular, as something with public health consequences.
Yeah, that's where I was hoping you were going to go right there, was the public health consequence, because it truly is something that is capable of impacting millions and millions of people with, and what I find to be so interesting specifically around sports betting is that revenue share situation and how that's going to drive people to not understand how at risk they actually are, if that makes sense. I mean, the phenomenon, and I think the number was like for Super Bowl Sunday was something like 150 billion dollars
Yes.
spent.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean that's a massive sum of money. And when there's massive sums of money attached to anything, it's going to get very tricky to have a public health safety message around it. Would you agree about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's hard. I think that's a common framing that we have regarding all problems with addiction, regarding all problems with behaviors. Is certainly true in alcohol. And I write
Yeah.
about this because it has a regulatory and an industry history. We have this long, long history, especially in the United States, of a narrative of individual responsibility. And in particular, that has
Mm.
served um, companies that make potentially harmful products. I'm not a prohibitionist. I don't think alcohol should be banned. I don't think that's plausible or helpful. Um, but there's a lot of ways that major researchers and policy analysts have said we haven't kept pace with taxing alcohol. We haven't kept pace, even just with inflation. So if we were just trying to minimize the externalities of this potentially harmful compound, we're just not doing our job. And it's something similar, although even worse, with gambling. That's like,
Yeah.
so in other words, there's like the individual responsibility framing, which says either you have a problem or you don't.
Right.
And this normally healthy activity is only dangerous for this small portion of people. And then on the other hand, we have a public health framing that recognizes that harms can fall across the spectrum. Somebody doesn't have to be completely powerless to experience harms or to cause harms to others, whether it's gambling or alcohol or whatever it might be. And there's a tension there. There really is a tension there. Across a lot of levels. Like people in mutual help recovery identify very strongly with being someone with addiction or being an alcoholic. Like I experience that myself. I personally identify as an alcoholic, for
Mhm.
example. And I try to wear that a bit lightly, but there are some people who really cling tightly to that sort of binary distinction because it feels like it makes them safe.
Right.
And I don't want to push people on that or like question it or criticize it too much. But there
We don't
is a
want to do
way
it. I
that
mean,
that
if it's working for them, it's working for
if it's
them,
working for
right?
them, totally. And who am I to say?
Right.
But there's a way that that kind of sets up
Mhm.
almost like a conceptual tension when we're talking about a spectrum of harms across say the spectrum of gambling harms or the spectrum of alcohol harms or whatever it might be.
Yeah. No, uh, I completely agree with that, and I think that the binary black and white, all or nothing kind of mentality that we have often gone into, I mean, which has really been the historic kind of framework for problematic use of whether it be drinking or opioids or stimulants or gambling or anything, right? It's either just like you said, I like that framing. I haven't thought of it that way as the individual versus kind of the like it's your problem, right? If you can't handle it, then you should do something about it, as opposed to like, no, actually, we're all at risk. We're all
Hmm.
capable of, and how we interject that and where we define problematic for ourselves before we get to catastrophic failures for people is really important. And it does create a lot more gray than what we have historically been willing to see in any of these types of like I said, substances or behavior patterns. Some of the things that I really appreciated about the article with regards to gambling specifically were some of the ways that we don't even recognize behaviors or things that are leading us down a path very early on. So
Yeah.
I'm talking specifically with this regards to some of the points that you made with parents and recognizing video games. I mean, I'm a parent of boys, so I have been, navigating video games for decades. And I feel like it's a really like it's almost like a gateway drug, to be
Hmm.
honest. I
Hmm.
mean, to gambling, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it can be, and there are different kinds of engagement with technology that can be more or less harmful, I believe. But I totally
Mhm.
identify. I mean, listen, I'm the son of a young boy, and we only recently made the decision in our family to introduce, very careful and time-bounded video games. And I think about my own childhood, but I was starting to have problems with alcohol, but I would say like in high school, I had real problems with video game playing. And it's all of a piece. It was a kind of experiential avoidance that took me out of the moment, and I needed to develop another repertoire eventually of just being comfortable in my own skin and navigating life. But, I went from video games to alcohol to other drugs. And
Mhm.
that, like, did the
Mhm.
video games cause me to wind up psychiatrically hospitalized during my psychiatric training? Probably not, but there are ways that I think, in the same way that you can practice psychological skills, you can practice experiential avoidance. If somebody gets in the habit, and that's kind of like a jargony phrase, but people can get in the habit of, um, checking out or going to false refuges rather than developing tolerance, developing psychological skills for meeting discomfort or for tuning into the present. Um, So, like I'm glad you brought this question up actually, because they actually cut a few pieces for space um, from the essay about kids. There's more
Yeah,
that we could say about prevention. Um, but like some of the points I made were um, there's lots of ways that kids can be exposed to gambling like dynamics. Like there are lots of ways that gambling dynamics enter into video games. The most clear and straightforward one is casino games, simulated casino
right.
games. The numbers are actually quite high. Uh, many, many kids get exposed to casino simulations, and then we even have some evidence that that increases the risk of the development of future gambling problems. Um, but there are other ways too. I mean, like one of the pieces that was cut was loot boxes. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but like they go by different names.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah. Like
but
I
it's
know
the
what
thing
you're
where
talking
like
about.
you
Like the
spend
yeah,
real
right.
money on
Yeah,
some like cruddy digital box,
yeah,
and like it has a big question mark on it sometimes, and the kid
right.
might get a skin or like a different
Right, right,
um
right, right. Like a different, yeah, avatar or
like a
something
different
kind of.
outfit for their
Yeah, yeah,
virtual
yeah,
character.
yeah.
Like maybe,
Right,
maybe it has a bunch of weapons, or maybe it just has some like nonsense.
right.
Um, these things are actually extremely well designed and very compelling. And there are many, many cases of kids that have spent hundreds of dollars of their parents' money on this type of thing, precisely because they're very well designed to capitalize on reward dynamics to grab kids and introduce them to a gambling-like dynamic. So much so that even the Low Countries, so Belgium and the Netherlands, have actually restricted loot boxes. They say you can't even have these things. It's essentially regulated as gambling. So that's another example of like, more specific and active common sense regulations that I think policymakers can consider. It's not a binary regulatory question too. It's not like we have to ban all gambling versus the doors are wide open. I mean, we
We can
can.
make, yeah, common sense. I love that. I love that. And I know you say that in the essay, the common sense strategies, right? And I think
Mhm.
that's one of the places that what you and I talk about align so well is that when we start to believe that common sense strategies actually make a difference and that we can actually impact behavior change without telling people that they can never drink again, that they can never do something again, that when, or, it's all black and white, if we start making small steps. So I'm going to ask you, because this you've
Mhm.
undoubtedly heard that the U.S. Surgeon General is recommending that the United States start putting cancer label warnings on alcohol bottles. So that's sort of a regulatory step towards at least educating people, because there's a lot of people that don't even realize that alcohol causes cancer. So like they don't see it that way. They know like smoking, they've got that message like, yeah, that obviously causes lung cancer. I get that. They don't necessarily equate alcohol with cancer. In your mind, is that a positive step in towards a regulatory change that the United States could start making?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's common sense that
Yeah, fall into the
uh
common sense category.
yeah, it's common sense that like we know that these risks are there, and there is an impaired public understanding of it. And I was interviewed for another outlet, an Australian news agency recently about something similar. We're comparing alcohol and cigarettes, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a really interesting comparison. And the history actually helps us a lot here because tobacco has been around for a long, long time in North American cultures, and it's been around ever since Columbus's expeditions from Europe to the New World, the so-called New
Right.
World. And so there's a long history of tobacco and tobacco use, and everybody who has seen smoking or had a relative who smokes or has smoked themselves know that it can be really like nicotine and tobacco. They can be really, really compelling. However, we've only had the hand rolled cigarette for a little more than 100 years. The not hand rolled, excuse me, the machine rolled cigarette for
Mm-hmm.
100 years. So it was really like the mass marketing and the mass production of cigarettes that drove the cost down, made them much more widely available. And so smoking and all of the consequent risks and problems didn't really take off until, say, like the earlier part of the 20th century. So that's important because we have a much shorter cultural history of smoking in the world in general, in
Mm-hmm.
the United States also, whereas alcohol is deeply, deeply woven into our culture. We've had alcohol, like there are accounts of Mesopotamian soldiers being
Right.
paid in beer rations. Like as long as you look back, you can see accounts of harmful drunkenness and alcohol problems. Um, so I don't know that um, we can regulate alcohol or put warning labels on alcohol in the exact same way that it worked in tobacco. Like I
Hmm.
was born in the early 80s. So I saw tobacco products go from being widely accepted to
Right.
widely recognized as harmful. I don't know that we get the same sort of paradigm shift with
Hmm.
alcohol, but there is some evidence, and like you've probably talked about on the show, and people have seen in other places that there is a changing cultural consensus around alcohol. The needle is moving at least a little bit where people are recognizing the significant harms of alcohol. So, like if the messaging is accurate, if it's truthful, if it's in accordance with the data, then absolutely
Yeah.
um, we should spread that consciousness.
And I think that you're right in the fact, I mean, I know you're right. The societal narrative around alcohol has been shifting in terms of moving away from something that's seen as innocuous, safe, just a part of life, fun, everything else, and even maybe healthy, right? Like there was definitely a narrative at some points in time that alcohol was good for you and good for your health. And I think we're moving away from that and towards people seeing alcohol in a way that I think that if we're going to include it in our lives, we do it in a low risk way, in a minimalist way, if at all. But the soberish or the people experimenting with lifestyles of being completely alcohol free and understanding that they have the capacity to do that. Hey there, it's Molly taking a quick break to talk with you about Sunnyside. You all know that Sunnyside is my app of choice and my recommendation for a tool to help you create sustainable change around your drinking. One of the things that I love about Sunnyside is their commitment to improving the user experience. And that has been a constant since I started working with them nearly 3 years ago now. Since June this year, they have added the Android version of their iOS app. So now it's available for Apple users and all Android users. It's the same Sunnyside experience across all of those devices. And it's just another example of their commitment to improving the user experience. Another example would be the fact that now you can set it up for push notifications. So you can take all of the daily texts, the reminders, and put them into a push preference so that you determine how you want to receive the support from Sunnyside. I would love for you to check it out. Go to www.sunnyside.co/Molly to get started with a 15-day free trial today. One of the quotes that I wanted to share from this article, because I think it kind of talks about what we're talking about right here, is while you said, while it's true that most gamblers don't develop severe addictions, we should regulate potentially harmful products based on their full spectrum of impacts, not just their most extreme outcomes. So it's kind of what we're talking about here is like, yes, we should regulate. So if you're telling me, what I hear you saying is that it's going to take some time to have a paradigm shift around alcohol anywhere near along the same lines that happened with regards to smoking. If the warning on the side of the bottle isn't good enough, well, it isn't going to be enough. We can say that way, not good enough, just it isn't going to be enough. What else can we do with regards to these impacts of products, whether it's alcohol, whether it's gambling, whether it's anything that has the potential to impact us in these severe ways? But most people, many people, still enjoy having them in their lives. What is the best method from a public health perspective of getting that message out?
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad we returned to the public health framing. And I mean, I just want to mention that I drew in large part, there's a very recent Lancet Public Health Commission on gambling. The Lancet is one of the top
Yeah.
UK medical journals, and they periodically do these public health commissions. So they did one on gambling, and I linked to it and I put some excerpts in it in an accompanying Substack post that I did about this article
Awesome.
because there's so much of in terms of like resources and links that I couldn't fit into the New York Times piece. Um, and for people who are really interested in the full spectrum from individual acts all the way up to like what am I lobbying my state capital about,
Hmm.
both of which are things people can do. Uh, yeah, there's like over 50 pages of information about that. So I guess my response, honestly, Molly, is that like I don't know what the one best response is because the situation is dynamic and responsive both to context and to the potentially harmful product we're talking about. Alcohol has been around for a while, aside from adding caffeine to alcohol or the popularity of White Claw or like these other formulations. Like there can always be changes in bottling laws. There's alcohol delivery services. There are ways that we can make it more or less accessible, and those do matter. But it's nowhere near what's happened with gambling. Gambling is something that really used to be confined to Vegas and a
Right.
little bit Atlantic City, um, and of course the illicit markets, of which is a big market, of course. Um, and now it's everywhere. I mean, technically it's only in some states, not every state is legal. Like famously, both Texas and California have not legalized sports betting. That's really interesting, right? Because Texas and California are on different ends of the political spectrum. But like through different routes, they both arrived at the same conclusion that this is harmful. That we can get into that if we want to. But gambling is ubiquitous, even though some states technically it's not legal because it's on the internet and people can use a VPN or they
Yeah.
have other
I
ways
was
of
like, so yeah, so
getting
right. I
access
mean,
to
it's
it.
like, yeah, like we can make it illegal, and that I'm betting that there were betting, get that? That
Yeah,
there were people in Texas and in California wagering on the Super Bowl.
of
I'm just
course.
just saying.
Of course. Using
Yeah,
these sites and all the rest.
right.
Um, so like the the right responses, the right types of responses, um, in the case of gambling, which is developing so rapidly and is really interwoven with the sort of like technological soup that we all find ourselves in. I think
Yeah.
everybody nowadays feels like they're questioning their relationship to the news and to social media and how much information do I need to have streaming in through my eyeballs and how much do I even want to be interacting with media and that we're at a moment right now with the anxious generation and subsequent books. Nicholas Carr has a new book where people are really interested
Yeah.
in the
I
gray
just read
area
that
as it
book.
relates to
Yep.
yeah, and I love Nicholas Carr. I haven't read the new one yet, but people are interested in that gray area where control is possibly impaired, but not completely eradicated. We see that in a lot of different ways. Um, in a way, like the conversation is like a little more complicated with gambling just because the actual mechanisms that are being used to target us and the ways that they are available are so much more different than, say, for example, uh, alcohol.
Yeah, maybe alcohol, but even if I know in the article you mentioned that on Super Bowl Sunday, binging on the food too, right? Like snack foods. Like we can go back into history to understand when people exhibit problematic. It's kind of scary, but when people exhibit problematic behavior around a substance or a behavior or anything else, it's almost like a going to happen without question that industries around it are going to figure out ways to make that substance or that behavior or anything even more attractive, right? So
Hmm.
like the food industry went through lots of science to get to like some of these highly processed foods more attractive to us, highly concentrated with salt and with fat and with sugar. And so that it's literally like your brain is just lighting up when you're ingesting it. And it's kind of like what you're saying with regards to the devices and how they are being able to tap into our that reward center in the brain to turn it on and get you to want to gamble or do whatever. It's fascinating and terrifying all in the same breath.
Yeah, yeah. And part of one of the titles I wanted that they didn't like, because people never people never titled their own essays in the New York Times or otherwise,
Right.
and probably rightfully so, because my all my titles are bad. Everybody has
Ah,
always chosen, like, The Urge wasn't mine either. Um, but one of the points I wanted to make was about what sports betting teaches us about addiction as a phenomenon. And
yeah.
one of my hobby horses is um, addiction is something more like a process than it is a state that happens to us. And
Hmm.
that by that token, addiction is in all of us. This is a concept that's in The Urge too,
Right.
is that the processes that go awry in addiction are the same things that cause everyday vulnerabilities. They're just most clearly on display, and they lead to the most disordered place when
Hmm.
we see cases of severe addiction. And that's really important for these cases because, in particular, when we're talking about like a family or an individual, how do I manage these things? Do I keep alcohol in my home? Do I have the gambling app on my device? Like, what do I do? Like, do I delete Instagram from my phone? Is it making me too sad? Whatever the question is, we tend to get too focused on sort of like the object of the behavior as if it's an invading external force that's infecting us, and there's a lot of reasons why we have that, especially in drug policy. The like foreign invading drugs are cast as sort of like contagious plague-like invaders, and that's usually the way we talk about drugs, whether it's fentanyl or cannabis back in the 1930s or what have you. And the truth of the matter is, there are some uh, stimuli, like there's the ultra processed foods are stronger than broccoli, and
Right.
Instagram is stronger than, say, like pulling up the Kindle app and reading a book. And alcohol is stronger as vodka than it is as like a light beer. That's true. There are gradations, but really, um, all those things are propensities. And at the end, the addictive process is a process. It's a thing that the individual does. And I say this with total respect for people who identify as addicted, as somebody who identifies as addicted. Um, like sometimes people get offended when I introduce the language of, say, choice and self-control into addiction, but I think we've obscured that too much, and it kind of contaminates the discussion for people who kind of think they're in that gray zone. Like, what am I doing? Do I really have a problem? It also contaminates the discussion about how do we think about these things. We get stuck in these very basic discussions about, like, is this video game addictive? Well, Fortnite's addictive, but is Minecraft addictive? Or da, 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 da.
Right.
Like, that's not the right conversation to be having, because it's not about like the object or the
Right.
thing. It's really about the person.
Yeah. That is kind of, and you say that in this article, another quote from that, when you're talking, you're in this one again, specifically talking about gambling, but I think it's true for everything, just like kind of what you just said. Most will not qualify as having true addictions, but many will feel a glimmer of diminished control, which reminds us that addiction is an important sense in all of us. What I like that sentence, right? Will feel a glimmer of diminished control. When we talk about gray areas and the whole idea around problematic usage, and whether it's video games or gambling or alcohol or junk food or or Instagram, you name it, right? It's that moment when that glimmer, when you're asking yourself the questions like, should I, shouldn't I? This doesn't feel quite, I no longer feels all the way positive for me anymore. It doesn't feel positive. There's something here that I need that's worth exploring. And that's the part where I think that we really, I for one, want to focus a lot of attention and education for people on, is that idea that we do want to, wherever it is, ask ourselves these questions. Because if we can stop framing addiction, right, in our brains as something that is, and I think that's what The Urge does so brilliantly, the book, is stop framing it as a moral judgment, as something that is shameful, but as something that's really truly a part of all of us. And it's a part that our brains are literally kind of predisposed and wired to create cycles of addiction, quote unquote. Then we can look at ourselves and say, okay, this thing that I'm talking about, whether it's a behavior or a substance or anything else, before it gets to a catastrophic problem, if we talk about it earlier and more often and look at it and say, okay, but am I happy? Like, do I like this? How I'm using this in my life? How do I like how I'm including it? Does it feel peaceful? I talk about that all the time around here, having a peaceful relationship. Is this something? And if it's causing anxiety, if it's causing me to worry, then it doesn't matter whether I am addicted or not. It matters that it's not peaceful. I'm no longer comfortable with how I'm including it. And it's worth evaluating. It's worth looking at, and it's worth figuring out the why behind that. Why am I doing it?
Yeah. No, well said. I think that that crucial question about the actual human experience is the part that gets missed when we focus on, is this or isn't this addictive? Or do I have a problem or don't I have a problem? As if like you cross a line and then
Right.
it switches like a light bulb. It doesn't work that way. I described briefly in the essay a case from my private practice of a
Yeah.
young man who I chose because he probably doesn't even meet criteria for problem gambling, which is a sort of like lower
Right.
intensity classification. Um, Somebody who's not having any problems making his rent, who's totally financially stable, but he's stuck in a pattern of deleting his betting app. He reinstalls it. He's trying to regulate his experience of it. It's the experience of betting that feels pressured and unpleasant and conflicted. Um, and so that guy, for example, and many others, doesn't qualify as having a disorder. Couldn't
Mm-hmm.
be
Yeah.
diagnosed with a disorder according to the official psychiatric diagnostic manual, but it is still is disordered, is having
Mm-hmm.
the experience of like deleting the app and reinstalling it and kind of battling with himself and trying to pre-commit and saying, I'll only gamble X amount of this, but then exceeds his limit, whatever it might be.
Right.
Um, and when we take the focus away from like, do I qualify for some sort of condition or how do I label or describe my issue to more of just the moment to moment awareness? What is this doing for me? All behaviors make sense, addictive behaviors included.
Mm-hmm.
What is
Mm-hmm.
what is the sense making that's going on here? What am I reaching for? To the extent I feel an urge or a craving or whatever, like what is this really speaking to? What is the feeling underneath it? Um, that's the part that gets missed when we get too focused on the sort of like all or nothing binary thinking around regulation or otherwise.
Yeah. And I love that. I'm so happy you brought that up, because one of the things that I think that even stories of abstinence or stories of, sober living, and I think that one of the things that I appreciate about your journey and your story too is that you sought out the other side, the mindfulness, the meditation, that piece, because you understood that just keeping the substance out of your life wasn't actually going to solve what you were trying to accomplish with it in the first
Exactly.
place, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that is a piece that people do miss all the time with regards to their behaviors and the substances or anything else. We have to address the underlying emotional capacity. That's what is it that we believe we are getting the from the gambling, from the alcohol, from the social media, from the junk food, from whatever it is that is causing us that glimmer of loss of control, whatever that is. We have to understand that it isn't the substance, it isn't just that thing. We are actually seeking something, some sort of emotional solution out of typically what it is that we are choosing to misuse. So
Yeah.
um, I love this conversation. And I know that you talk about addiction, but you also talk a lot about psychology and everything on your Substack. So, can you share with my listeners, please, where they can learn more about what you're talking about on an ongoing basis, and where they can connect with you?
Thanks so much for asking. Yeah, I think the easiest way to find me is just search for me on Substack,
Okay.
Carl Erik Fisher. unfortunately you can spell Carl and Erik and Fisher in different ways. But
Right.
like when you put all three of them together, it's hard to miss me. The name of my Substack is called Rat Park. That's sort of like a little inside joke, because it comes
Yeah.
from a classic behavioral addiction, not behavior, classic behavioral psychology research study that looked at rats with Bruce Alexander, and I write a little bit about there. But yeah, the focus really, especially these days, is on flourishing. It's like what does it mean to be flourishing? What does it mean when we're seeking well-being and recovery, or however we conceive of our
Yeah.
efforts towards psychological health and growth? And I'm a big proponent of many paths to recovery, many pluralistic ways of understanding recovery or substance problems or otherwise. And so, my goal is to really explore the variety there with respect, but also to give people concrete tools there. So yeah, Carl Erik Fisher, Rat Park, Substack. You can also find it at my website too.
Perfect. I will link it all in the show notes, folks. Carl, thank you for coming back on Alcohol Minimalist. We talked before we jumped on, and you said, "Okay, so what do you want to hit on, or are we just going to kind of go?" And I said, "We're just going to kind of go."
Yeah,
And so, I
that's
appreciate,
perfect. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your willingness to indulge my scientific neuropsychology interests in all of these things, and also to share your very important work with my group. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Of course, yeah. It was a real pleasure. It's nice to reconnect. Thanks so much for all your work. And I'm glad to have the chance to talk about all the overlaps here. It's really
Yep.
important.
Awesome. Thanks, Carl. Thanks for listening to the Alcohol Minimalist podcast. Take something you learned from this week's episode and put it into action. Changing your drinking habits and creating a peaceful relationship with alcohol is 100% possible. You can stop worrying, stop feeling guilty about overdrinking, and become someone who desires alcohol less. I work with people in 2 different ways, and you can learn about them over at my website. Go to www.mollywatts.com/workwithme, or reach out to me directly. Shoot me an email, molly@mollywatts.com. We'll jump on a call and decide what might work best for you. This podcast is really just the beginning of our conversation. Let's keep it going. If there's one thing I know, it's that change is way easier when you stop trying to do it alone.